Hi, it's Professor Gould. In this section, we are going to start talking about how cells reproduce themselves, what we call cellular reproduction. We're going to start actually by not talking about that. We're going to talk about the cell cycle and the life cycle that every single cell goes through. So cellular reproduction is this process where the cells reproduce themselves, and we call it cell division. This is happening constantly. Most of the cells in your body can do this. They're going to, old cells are going to do mitosis, this process of cell division, create new cells to replace them. In other living organisms, this is constantly happening as organisms grow, as old cells break down. So this constant process of creating new cells to replace old cells. And the process this happens is called mitosis, and we really have to stop talking about it because it's so divisive. Kidding. Okay. There are a lot of ways that organisms use cell division by mitosis to replace old cells, like we said, but also to grow new cells. You have to have a cell to make a new cell. So in the early human embryo, it starts out as one cell. That cell then undergoes mitosis to create new cells, dividing up the material that was in that original cell into more and more and more cells. Other organisms may reproduce themselves entirely. Amoeba can make a new amoeba just by dividing their one cell into another cell. Other organisms, such as sea stars and plants, can actually grow from just a portion of themselves. So sea stars can regrow a leg or a whole body from one leg if this main disc in the middle is surviving. Plants, a lot of plants, almost all plants in fact, can grow from a clipping if given the proper nutrients. And that's all done by cell division by mitosis. Some animals can actually reproduce by using mitosis alone without sexual reproduction. Now, when we talk about sexual reproduction, we don't necessarily mean sexual intercourse. We just mean the fusion of an egg and sperm into a new living being. Many animals, including many species of lizards, can do something that we call parthenogenesis, meaning that a female can create viable eggs that will grow into adults without any sperm, just with her eggs by themselves. So this happened in 2006. A Komodo dragon, which is a giant lizard native to Indonesia, laid a whole nest of viable eggs, even though she had never been with a male. So, and there are other species of lizards that primarily reproduce by parthenogenesis. This is not something that mammals can do. There is no mammal that can do parthenogenesis. All right, so the cell life cycle. Before cells can reproduce themselves, they've got a life to lead, just like, organisms don't spend their whole time reproducing, they do stuff. So we call this the life cycle of the cell, or the cell cycle. And it's divided into 4 phases. The first phase is called G1, or the gap 1 phase. The second is S phase. The third is G2, or the gap 2 phase. And the final one is M phase, or mitosis. All of this part, the G1, the S, the G2, those are all together called interphase. And this is most of a cell's lifetime. For cells that do mitosis, it's about 90% of their life cycle. And then there's only about 10% spent doing mitosis. So just remember that. We're going to talk in really big detail about mitosis. We're going to talk through all the phases of mitosis, but just remember this is only one portion of a cell's life cycle. So for example, a plant cell, it's doing photosynthesis for this other 90% of the time, and then occasionally it does mitosis to make a new cell. Okay, so just remember that. So this first phase of the cell cycle, the main phase, as I said, is called interphase. It's divided into 3 smaller phases. And this is when the cell is doing its normal function. And one of those functions is going to be preparing for mitosis. One of the things that's going to happen during that is duplicating the cell's DNA. During interphase, chromosomes are not actually individually visible. So this is a microscope slide of an onion root that's growing. And so a lot of the cells in this onion root are doing mitosis to replicate themselves. And you can see the cell walls here, so you can see where each cell is. Some of these were the section when this tissue was sectioned. Some of the nuclei were cut out. That's the word I'm trying to get. And so we can't, it looks like it doesn't have a nucleus. Of course it does. So all of these cells where you can't see distinct chromosomes as strands, those are all in interphase. They're not doing mitosis. At the beginning of mitosis, the chromosomes become visible, and we can see them as these little like worm-like strands. That's how you know a cell is entering mitosis, okay? During interphase, the DNA, remember it's a double helix with a sugar phosphate backbone and base pairs between those backbones. It twirls, it swirls and does this helix. And it's actually not just randomly floating around. It's actually really well organized, wrapped around these groups of proteins called histones. And each of these little groups of some chromosome wrapped around histones is called a nucleosome. And if we look at a transmission electron micrograph, remember this can do like 60,000 times magnification, as opposed to a light microscope that can do like 100 times magnification. This can show us these little nucleosomes with little strands of DNA between. So these little groups of DNA look like beads on a string. This whole thing is called chromatin. Remember that from an earlier lecture when we were learning just about this basic DNA double helix. Remember that each of these chromosomes is a long strand of DNA, really long. All of the DNA in one human cell, if you stretched it all out, it would be about 5 feet long. So these are very long molecules. Each one has a bunch of different genes on it. So for example, here's a monster DNA with a gene for unicorn horn, a gene for eyes, how many eyes, whether it's tall or short, what color hair. There's also a lot of DNA in between the genes. Some of that's regulatory DNA to turn genes on or off. Some of that has other functions, and some of it we don't know what the functions are. So when we're talking about a chromosome, we're talking about a bunch of genes in each chromosome. All right, so that's the first phase of interphase. So we've got interphase is this 90% of the cell's lifetime. The first phase, the cell is just doing what it does. Okay, it's just, doing photosynthesis or breaking down something the cell engulfed, whatever. The S phase is when the DNA is actually going to be duplicated. And the rest of the cytoplasm of the cell is also going to start to be duplicated, because the cell needs to make lots and lots of everything inside the cell so that when it splits itself in half, each cell has enough cytoplasm to do its stuff. Okay, so in our next section, we're going to talk about this S phase, what happens there, and how the cell duplicates the DNA to prepare for mitosis.